The pass at Thermopylae was so narrow that two carts could barely pass each other. On one side stood the cliffs, on the other the sea, and in between a small Greek force waited for the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. There were no speeches, no music, just the sound of armor, wind, and waves. Tonight we walk back into that moment. Not the version shaped by movies and legends, but the real story shaped by politics, alliances, fear, and careful strategy. Who were the men who stood there? Why did they stay? And what did this battle actually change in the history of Greece and Persia? Take a slow breath and let the story unfold. The order went out from Susa and it moved across the empire faster than any marching army. Couriers rode hard along the royal road carrying the same instruction in many languages. Governors were to send men, ships, food, animals, and metal. Storehouses were to be filled. Bridges were to be planned. In the palaces of Persia, scribes wrote lists until their hands cramped. In the ports of Phoenicia, shipwrights shaped cedar and pine into hulls. In Egypt, grain and dried fish were measured and packed. In Babylon, officials counted livestock. The king wanted Greece and the empire had the habit of obeying. Xerxes ruled a state built for large projects. His father Darius had expanded Persian power across Western Asia and he had already tested Greece. That earlier clash ended with a Persian defeat at Marathon, the kind of defeat that stung because it came from people the empire counted as small. Darius died before he could return. Xerxes inherited the throne and the unfinished work. He also inherited court politics. Advisors argued around him. Some spoke for consolidation. Others pressed for conquest. The idea that a few Greek cities had fought back carried real consequences because it set an example for other provinces. Xerxes chose a campaign that would answer that resistance in a way the empire understood. He would bring an army so large that Greek alliances would break under pressure. He would bring a fleet so strong that Greek coasts would be exposed. He would arrive with supplies and engineers and make the march itself a demonstration of control. Preparation turned into a public show. Xerxes moved to inspect forces and confirm loyalty. Satraps came with gifts. Commanders assembled units drawn from across a wide map. There were Persians and Medes. There were men from Bactria and Sogdiana, from India, from the Caspian regions. There were archers, spearmen, cavalry, and light troops used to rough ground. The navy gathered as well. Phoenician cities supplied skilled sailors. Egyptians brought their own vessels. Ionians and other Greeks under Persian rule came too, a reminder that the Aegean already had Persian reach. The scales strained every system that supported it. Water mattered as much as weapons. Grain mattered as much as armor. Animals had to be fed and also had to pull wagons. The campaign demanded roads that could take traffic, officers who could keep order, and disciplined schedules that prevented crowding at wells. The geography between Persia and Greece forced choices. A march over land required crossing the Hellespont, the narrow stretch of water between Asia and Europe. A fleet moving along the coast had to pass dangerous points where storms could break ships. Xerxes wanted to solve these problems with engineering. Work began on a canal across the Isthmus of Mount Athos, where an earlier expedition had lost ships in severe weather. Digging took time and labor. It also sent a message. The king expected success and would reshape land to reduce risk. At the Hellespont, engineers prepared bridges made of boats lashed together, anchored against current and wind. Cables were stretched. Planks were laid. The first attempt failed when storms tore it apart. Repairs began quickly. New cables were used. Anchors were set with more care. When the crossing was ready, the empire put on one of its largest public movements. Troops filed across in long lines. The weight of the army pressed boards and ropes. The sounds were practical: footfalls on wood, harness leather creaking, wheels on planks. The crossing took time because the numbers were immense. Ancient writers later offered enormous totals. Modern estimates vary and tend to be smaller. Yet every serious estimate still describes a force far beyond anything most Greek cities could field on their own. Xerxes had arranged that imbalance on purpose. Once in Europe, the army moved along a route that kept it close to water. The fleet provided support along the coast, carrying supplies. The march brought its own problems. Crowds of men and animals trampled fields and strained local resources. Wells ran low. Food had to be distributed in a way that prevented fighting within the ranks. The Persian system relied on organization. Depots were established. Local leaders were ordered to provide provisions. Each day of marching had to end with water and food. As Xerxes advanced, news traveled ahead of him. Greek observers heard reports that grew with each retelling. Some stories focused on numbers. Others focused on the king himself, describing his wealth and splendor. Even when details were uncertain, leaders in Greece understood that this was an invasion designed to overwhelm. Xerxes sought a decisive end to resistance. A single victory over scattered defenders would allow him to push deeper into Greece and force cities to submit one by one. He could accept surrender from some and punish others as examples. The campaign already carried that pattern because the empire often offered a choice between cooperation and destruction. Messengers reached the Greek mainland in dusty clothes. They came by ship into busy harbors, then by foot along rough roads, carrying the same core report. Xerxes had crossed into Europe. The Persian army moved with engineers, wagons, and animals, and the fleet kept pace along the coast. In the cities of Greece, officials listened in public squares and council chambers. The news created quick decisions. Some leaders sent riders to neighboring cities. Some ordered extra grain measured out from public stores. Some called up men of fighting age to drill with spear and shield. In places that had walls, masons inspected gates. In places that depended on ships, ship captains checked rigging and counted oars. Athens moved first on the water. The city had spent years arguing about its future, and the argument had produced timber, bronze, and hard work in shipyards. Themistocles, an Athenian politician with sharp instincts, had pushed for a strong fleet. He had convinced his fellow citizens to use silver from the mines at Laurion to build triremes, fast warships powered by 3 banks of oars. In the harbor at Piraeus, the result could be seen in rows of hulls pulled up onto slips, men sanding planks, carpenters fitting joints. Triremes demanded constant care. Oars had to be stored and kept straight. Rope had to stay dry. Crews had to practice until they could move as one unit. Themistocles understood that the Persian invasion would arrive by sea as well as land. The Persian fleet could land troops behind Greek defenses, raid coastlines, and cut off supplies. Athens had a tool to answer that threat, and the Athenians had the manpower to row if they could be organized and trained. In the months before the invasion, the city's poorer citizens found pride and purpose at the oar benches. Sparta prepared on land with a different rhythm. Spartan society was built around training and discipline. Adult Spartan men lived in a system that required military readiness. Their daily life revolved around drills, communal meals, and strict expectations. They also lived under a calendar shaped by religious duties. That calendar mattered when the Persian threat grew close because Sparta could not simply march whenever it pleased. Festivals and rituals set limits. The ephors, the elected officials who helped govern, received reports from scouts and allies. They weighed the danger against tradition. Spartan kings held authority in war, and one of them would lead any major expedition. Sparta also managed a large population of helots bound to the land and forced to work for Spartan households. Every campaign had to consider security at home. The Greek cities understood that no single polis could face Xerxes alone. Rivalries that had simmered for decades had to be set aside. Representatives began to gather for talks. They met in places where travel was possible. A congress formed at Corinth where envoys could speak and where decisions could be recorded. The alliance that emerged placed Sparta in a leading role on land because Spartan hoplites had a reputation for discipline. Athens held influence on sea strategy because it had invested heavily in ships. Other cities brought their own strengths. Corinth had ships and sailors. Aegina had naval experience. Megara controlled key passes near the isthmus. Some regions hesitated. Some cities sent earth and water to Xerxes, the Persian symbols of submission. Decisions had to become plans. The Allied Council faced a blunt map. Xerxes could enter Greece from the north through the pass into central Greece. The Greeks needed a place where a smaller force could delay a larger one. They also needed the fleet positioned where it could prevent Persian ships from sailing around defensive lines. Geography offered an answer. Thermopylae was a narrow pass along the coast, squeezed between mountains and sea. The name came from hot springs in the area, and the ground itself forced an army into a confined path. It also lay near the sea routes that Persian ships would use. If Greek hoplites held there, they could block the overland advance. If the Greek fleet held the nearby straits at Artemisium, it could contest the Persian navy and prevent an easy landing behind the pass. The two positions formed a linked defense. The council agreed on this paired strategy. Messages went out. Cities were told how many men and ships to provide. Commanders were assigned. Supply arrangements were discussed in practical terms: grain shipments, water access, the movement of pack animals. Inside Athens, the plan required difficult choices. Many Athenians owned land outside the city walls and war-threatened farms. The fleet strategy demanded that the navy be ready to fight, and that meant pulling men into crews who might otherwise defend their own neighborhoods. The city held assemblies where free male citizens gathered and voted. Speakers argued about risk, about honor, and about survival. Orders were drafted. Ship crews were organized by tribe and neighborhood. Officers checked lists of names. Men who had never rowed before learned the movements and practice runs near the harbor. Athenian soldiers drilled on land as well. Yet everyone understood that the sea battle could decide whether Athens endured. In Sparta, the plan narrowed toward a single question: who would lead and how many could go at once? Leonidas, one of Sparta's kings, carried military authority and the weight of tradition. He was older than the men who trained around him, hardened by years in the Spartan system. He would lead the initial force north. The number would be small at first, shaped by religious observances and the need to keep order at home. Yet the intent was clear. Sparta would send a king and a guard force to the pass as the alliance gathered its full strength. The decision carried danger. Everyone involved understood that the Persians would arrive with overwhelming numbers. A small force at Thermopylae would need discipline and allies, and it would need the terrain to work in its favor. While preparations continued, the Allied Council watched the clock. Each day Xerxes marched west tightened the schedule for Greek assembly. The North Greek regions felt pressure first. Some leaders asked the alliance for help. Some looked to their own survival and negotiated with Persia. The allies needed the pass held long enough for Greek cities further south to organize defenses at the Isthmus of Corinth if required. Orders became urgent. Men began to travel to muster points with their armor and provisions. Farmers left fields at a critical time of year. Young men checked spear shafts and repaired straps on shields. Priests performed rituals because divine favor mattered to these cities in practical ways. It shaped morale. It shaped whether leaders could justify a decision to their people. The path up to Delphi filled early, while the stone steps still held the night's coolness. Men arrived from different cities with dust on their sandals. They carried bronze coins for offerings, small statues and bowls of oil. Some brought goats for sacrifice. The sanctuary sat on the slope above the valley. Priests in clean garments moved between altars and storerooms. Smoke rose from burned fat and bits of meat. Spartan envoys reached the precinct with the same hard pace they used on roads. They carried the authority of their city and the urgency of the moment. The Persian army marched in Europe. The Greek alliance had chosen Thermopylae and Artemisium. Sparta had accepted command on land. The envoys followed the usual procedure. They paid the fee. They presented offerings. They waited their turn. Inside the temple, the process grew tighter. Priests purified the space. Water was brought for ritual washing. Leaves of laurel were handled and prepared. The priestess of Apollo, the Pythia, entered the inner area. Outside, petitioners waited with tense faces, listening for any sign. The oracle had a reputation built over generations, and cities treated its words like official guidance. The response that later writers recorded for Sparta carried a sharp edge. It spoke of a choice with two outcomes. One outcome meant Sparta's destruction. The other meant the death of a Spartan king. The phrasing held the kind of force that leaders could repeat in public because it created a clear path of duty. A city could accept sacrifice or face ruin. A king could accept death or watch his people suffer. In Sparta, where obedience to law shaped public life, such words had practical power. They could be used to settle debate. They could be used to justify the order to march with a small force first, to hold a pass long enough for allies to assemble. They also placed a burden on the king who would lead. The envoys carried the answer back south. In every city along the road, people were already counting days and measuring supplies. They spoke about the Persian numbers in the market and at fountains. They argued about which cities would fight and which would yield. When the Spartans returned home, they brought the oracle's words into a system of meetings and votes. The ephors convened. The council of elders met. Men listened while the envoys repeated the response in plain speech. The reaction showed in smaller signs. A man pressed his lips together. Another stared at the floor. The leaders discussed what the answer meant in terms of action. Sparta had religious obligations already set in the calendar, including the Carnea festival. The Olympic Games were also approaching. Sparta also needed to keep enough forces at home to manage the Helots. Yet the alliance needed a Spartan presence at Thermopylae quickly because delay would open the road into central Greece. The oracle's message fit the direction Sparta was already leaning. It gave the decision a shape. Leonidas stood at the center of that decision. He was one of Sparta's kings, a man raised in the Spartan training system. He knew the discipline of communal life and the strict expectations placed on citizens. He knew the weight of public duty because Sparta treated the king as a war leader under the oversight of the ephors. Leonidas listened to the report and watched the reactions of the men around him. He also understood the practical situation at Thermopylae. The pass could be held with a smaller force if the men were heavy infantry trained to fight in tight formation. The ground would reduce the Persian advantage in cavalry and numbers. Greek allies would join if Sparta showed leadership. The fleet would fight nearby. A holding action could change the schedule of the whole campaign. The selection of the Spartan contingent carried its own rules. Leonidas chose 300 men from the citizen body, men in their prime who had proven themselves. Each man carried armor that belonged to his household and also belonged to the city. Bronze helmets were checked for fit. Breastplates or linen corselets were inspected. Greaves were strapped on. Round shields were cleaned. Spear shafts were tested. Men carried short swords and packed provisions simply because speed on the road mattered. Each Spartan was accompanied by helot attendants who carried gear. Their presence was part of the logistics of any Spartan march. The men moved through the city and out onto the road with an orderly pace. Families watched from doorways. Spartan custom discouraged open displays. Yet everyone understood the risk. A king marching north under a prophecy carried a clear expectation. The march began as a military movement and as a political statement. Other Greek cities would measure Sparta's commitment by what they saw. Allies would join more readily if a Spartan king led. Leonidas set the pace. The men walked in formation when the road allowed it and broke into smaller groups when the terrain narrowed. They stopped at agreed points for water and food. They kept their weapons close. They avoided unnecessary talk. Along the way they met contingents from other cities. Some greeted the Spartans with relief. Some looked at them with caution because Spartan leadership came with authority. Leonidas accepted the allies and moved on toward the pass with the oracle's words carried in memory. Leonidas kept the column moving before sunrise when the road stayed firm. The Spartans carried their shields on the left arm and kept spears angled up. Helot attendants walked with the packs. The pace was steady, set by the men in front and held by the men behind. At springs and wells, Leonidas allowed short stops. Water was drawn quickly, shared, and the column moved again. The 300 were not a random group. Sparta called them the Hippias, an elite guard chosen from the citizen body. Their training showed in small habits. They checked the edge of a spearhead with a thumb. They adjusted a helmet cheek piece without looking down. Each man carried the equipment of a hoplite built for close fighting: a heavy round shield, a long spear, and a short sword. Some wore bronze breastplates that had been passed down. Others wore linen armor layered and stiffened. Leonidas watched them in motion. He knew what the pass demanded: men who held their place, men who kept order when tired and hungry. The road north gathered people the way a river gathers streams. From nearby towns, small groups joined at junctions. Some brought fewer men than promised because farms still needed hands. Some brought more because their leaders wanted to show commitment. Word spread ahead that a Spartan king was marching. That mattered. It pulled allies toward the plan and pushed fence-sitters into a decision. In the evenings, camp routines formed quickly. Fires were built in safe places. Spears were planted in the ground. Watch rotations were assigned. The Spartans ate simply and slept close to their shields. Leonidas kept talks with allied leaders short, focusing on where to meet and what to bring. The religious calendar still pressed on the decisions at home. Sparta's main army stayed back because the Carnea festival held them. Other Greek cities had their own obligations tied to the Olympic truce. These constraints shaped the first response. Leonidas's force functioned as a commitment and a signal, a small hard block placed early in the road. Later writers said Leonidas selected men who had living sons so their family lines would continue. Whatever the details, the result was clear on the march. These men expected danger. They had accepted it as part of the order. They spoke little about it. They focused on the next mile, the next water source, the next camp. When the column reached the region near Thermopylae, the ground and air changed. The coast lay close on one side, the mountains rose on the other, and the road narrowed into a passage that could be watched and defended. Hot springs gave off a sharp smell. Leonidas walked parts of it on foot, looking at the lines where men could stand shoulder to shoulder. He looked for firm ground where a hoplite could plant his feet. He looked for places where the enemy might try to climb around. The Spartans found an old wall built long before, a rough barrier of stone that had been damaged. They began repairs. Stones were lifted into place. Gaps were filled. Greek allies were already arriving or arrived soon after. The numbers grew beyond the 300. Men from Tegea and Mantinia came from Arcadia. Corinthians brought their own troops. Phocians arrived with knowledge of mountain paths. Thespians came with a decision that would later be remembered because they stayed. The total force at this stage stood in the thousands, not the tiny band that later retellings focus on. Command relationships had to be set. Leonidas held overall authority on land as the Spartan king. Leaders from other cities still spoke for their men. Leonidas addressed them directly using clear instructions about where units would stand, how the line would be rotated, and what signals would be used. The plan relied on discipline and on the pass itself. If men held formation, the Persians would be forced into a narrow fight. The defense also depended on what happened at sea. News traveled that the Greek fleet was moving to Artemisium, the northern point of Euboea, where the sea lanes narrowed. The Athenian triremes and the ships of other cities would face Persian crews that had more vessels and more experienced sailors. The sea battle mattered here on land because Persian ships could land troops behind the pass if they gained control of the water. Leonidas knew that the wall and the shield line alone could not stop an enemy who arrived from the rear. He relied on coordination, on time, and on the assumption that the Phocians guarding the mountain path would do their job. He sent men to inspect that path and confirm its defense. The camp at Thermopylae settled into a tense routine. Men sharpened spear points and checked the wood around their shield rims. They practiced moving forward and back in tight formation. They rested when they could because a battle could last days and exhaustion could break a line faster than wounds. Scouts moved north to watch for Persian vanguards. Runners carried updates between the pass and nearby towns. Leonidas used the time to fix the line of defense and to set expectations. Hold the pass, rotate tired men out, keep order, wait for the enemy. The road north stayed empty for stretches, then filled again with new arrivals and fresh reports. Each report tightened the sense that the main Persian force was close. The first Persian scouts appeared on the road in small groups, riding ahead of the main force. They watched the pass from a safe distance at first, then came closer, trying to read the Greek line, the rebuilt wall, and the tight space between mountain and sea. Greek sentries stood at the wall with shields resting against their legs and spears held upright. Behind them, men moved through camp with routine tasks. When the scouts turned back, dust rose behind their horses. The message went south to Xerxes. The pass was occupied. The Greeks had chosen to stand. Soon after, the Persian vanguard arrived in a long, steady flow. Infantry first, then cavalry, then supply wagons. The road that had felt quiet turned into a moving line of people and equipment. At a distance, the Persian camp looked like organized labor. Tents went up in sections. Fires were lit. Units formed their own spaces. Officers moved between groups. Food was distributed. Water was hauled. Guards were posted. A soldier could see ethnic differences in clothing and weapons across the camp. Some men carried wicker shields and short spears. Others carried bows. Some wore scale armor. Others wore felt caps. The number of men extended beyond what any Greek camp had seen. Ancient writers later reported very large totals. Modern estimates vary and often run lower, while still describing a force far larger than the defenders at Thermopylae. Xerxes arrived with his guard and took a position where he could observe the pass. He had made the march with planning and confidence, and he expected the Greeks to react the way many other communities had reacted when the empire arrived. He had already received submission from some Greek regions. He had already seen cities choose safety. He also understood that the defenders represented an alliance and that the alliance depended on morale. A quick Greek collapse would ripple through the rest of Greece. Xerxes ordered his officers to make contact. He asked questions about who led the defense and how many men stood there. He listened to reports that the Spartans were present and that a Spartan king commanded. He decided to wait. He waited for several days, expecting the defenders to leave once they saw the full Persian strength. In the Greek camp, the waiting stretched the nerves. Men woke before sunrise, ate what they could, and took their assigned positions. They watched the Persian activity across the open ground. They did not have the luxury of stepping away from the wall. The pass demanded constant readiness. On the Persian side, the waiting had its own tension. A large army consumed supplies every day. Animals needed forage. Men needed food and water. The longer the pause, the more the campaign depended on steady logistics. Xerxes also had to consider the message he sent to his own troops. A king who paused too long in front of a small barrier risked questions about his judgment. When surrender did not come, he moved to demands. He sent a messenger to the Greek line under a flag of truce. The messenger approached carefully, staying within sight of Greek sentries. Leonidas stepped out with a small group of Spartans and allied leaders nearby, all armed, all alert. The Persian messenger delivered a demand for submission. The words carried the king's authority. Give earth and water. Hand over weapons. Accept the Persian king as master. The request framed the situation as a practical choice. Surrender meant survival. Refusal meant destruction. Leonidas listened and answered without delay. He did not raise his voice. He spoke as a commander who had already accepted the reality of what stood in front of him. When the messenger demanded that the Greeks lay down their arms, Leonidas gave the response that later generations remembered, "Come and take them." The phrase carried the tone of a soldier speaking to another soldier. It also carried a simple fact. The Greeks held their weapons and their position. Any effort to remove them would require force in that narrow space. The messenger turned back and delivered the reply to Xerxes. The report hardened the situation. The defenders had chosen a fight. In the Greek camp, the message moved quickly through the ranks. Some men grinned. Some tightened their grip on spears. Leonidas ordered the line kept strong and the wall manned at all times. Units rotated so men could rest and eat in short shifts. Across the open ground, Persian soldiers began to move with more purpose. Officers gathered men and formed columns. Horns and shouted commands carried through the camp. The waiting was ending. The first Persian assault began after the morning routines had settled. Greek sentries watched a line form across the open ground, then several columns as officers aligned men shoulder to shoulder and began pushing them forward. The front ranks carried shields made for speed. Many held short spears. Archers moved behind them. The men advanced at a controlled pace, then faster as they reached the killing ground, the narrow mouth where the pass pinched down. Leonidas kept the Spartans in the line with allied hoplites arranged to fill the front. He held reserves close enough to rotate in when arms grew tired. The Greek formation stayed tight. The front row locked shields rim to rim, spears angled forward. The men stood close enough that the pressure of the line could be felt through the wood and bronze. The first clash came with a hard impact as Persian troops hit the spear points and shields. Greek spears drove into faces, throats and chests, then pulled back and struck again. Some Persian soldiers fell immediately and created obstacles for those behind. Others pushed forward until they met the wall of shields. Persian officers shouted orders and tried to force momentum. The crowding made it hard for men in the rear to see what was happening. The narrow space turned the attack into a grind. Greek hoplites used the weight of their shields to shove and keep the front stable. The pass allowed only a limited number of attackers to engage at once. The rest waited behind, pressed into the mass. The Persians tried to use arrows, yet the angle and distance at the tight front reduced their effect. Some arrows found gaps. Most clattered against bronze or stuck into shields. The Greeks kept stepping forward in small synchronized pushes, then settling back into position. Their officers watched the line and called for changes. When a man in the front row tired, another stepped into his place. The formation remained steady. Xerxes watched the first waves fail. He had expected the defenders to break after a short hard push. He saw instead a line that held and a field that filled with his own dead. He sent in more troops. The next waves came with fresh men from units that had not yet fought. They tried to find a weakness by changing the rhythm, pressing harder at certain points, trying to pull Greek shields aside, trying to push the hoplites back from the wall. The Greeks responded with the same discipline. They fought at close distance. They kept the shield wall intact. A hoplite who lost his spear reached for a second or drew his sword and stabbed in the crush. Men on the edges used the wall and the mountain slope to anchor their position. As casualties mounted, Persian commanders brought forward more experienced troops. The elite unit, often called the Immortals, entered the fight. They advanced with confidence and tried to force their way through with concentrated effort. Their spears and arrows had value in open ground. Here they faced a formation built for exactly this kind of contact. Greek spears reached them first. Greek shields absorbed impact. The Immortals pressed in and fought in the crush. Leonidas ordered short retreats at moments to draw attackers deeper into the narrow space, then a sudden forward push to trap them against the crowd behind. The maneuver created congestion in the Persian ranks. The Greeks then rotated the front again, bringing fresh arms into the spear work. The Immortals took losses and failed to break the line. The fighting continued into the day with repeated assaults that ended in the same result. Persian dead accumulated in front of the Greek position. Persian troops tried to pull bodies away to clear footing. Some fell while dragging. Others slipped on blood. Greek hoplites suffered fewer losses, yet the cost rose in bruises, cuts, and fatigue. Arms ached from holding heavy shields. When the pressure eased between waves, they drank from skins and reset their grip on spears. Leonidas kept the order clear. Hold the front, rotate frequently, keep the line compact. The Phocians stayed on the mountain path above, out of sight, doing their own watch duty. They did not see any movement on the trail that day. By late afternoon, the Persian attacks slowed. Xerxes had burned through men and achieved no breakthrough. He pulled back his troops and let them regroup, leaving the ground covered with bodies. In the Greek position, men stayed alert. They cleaned spear points, checked shield straps, replaced broken shafts. Some moved the wounded to the rear where allies applied bandages. The sun lowered. Fires began in both camps. Leonidas met briefly with allied leaders, keeping the discussion focused on practical issues: water supplies, rotation schedules, the condition of the wall. The Greeks had held for a full day. They expected the next to bring the same pressure. Dawn brought a hard reset. Men stepped over the same ground where bodies had fallen. Greek soldiers stood at their stations while attendants moved behind them with water and food. Some of the wounded stayed in the rear. Others insisted on returning to the line. Leonidas walked the front in short passes, stopping to look at spearheads, speaking a few words to officers. The Spartans kept their usual habits. A few sat with combs and worked their hair back, keeping it neat. Allied troops watched the gesture. It looked like routine. It also looked like confidence. Across the open ground, the Persian camp came to life again. Officers gathered units and pushed them forward in batches. Xerxes stayed close enough to see the mouth of the pass. The first pushes came fast, troops moving in a dense mass trying to close the distance before the Greeks could settle their spear points. They reached the narrow front and slammed into the shield wall. The Greeks answered with a clean rhythm. Spears stabbed forward in short controlled thrusts. Shields rose and dipped. Men behind the front reached between shoulders to pass forward spare spears when shafts snapped. The Persians pressed hard and suffered the same problem. The pass limited how many could fight. The crowd behind pushed the front ranks forward whether they wanted it or not. Greek hoplites used the moment when pressure increased to shove forward together, opening space for spear work. Leonidas changed the pattern. He ordered units to step out from the wall and fight in the narrow road itself, then fall back in good order. The move gave the Greeks a chance to clear bodies. It also forced the Persians to follow into a tighter space where their numbers crowded them again. The maneuver required discipline. The front rank stepped forward as one, then eased back in short steps. When the line reached the wall again, fresh men rotated into place. Xerxes committed stronger troops again. The Immortals returned and tried to force the line with concentrated pushes. Greek hoplites answered with the same tools. Shields shoved, spears stabbed, swords came out when the distance collapsed. The Greeks held their line and used quick rotations to keep arms fresh. Some Persians reached close enough to grab at shields. Greek soldiers struck hands and faces. Bodies fell and blocked the feet of those behind. By midday, the fighting had the look of work repeated under pressure. Men fought, pulled back, drank, and fought again. Toward the end of the day, the Persians withdrew again. The Greeks stayed at the wall, breathing hard, hands cramped around spear shafts. In the rear, attendants carried water. Scouts moved along the mountain slopes. The Phocians on the upper trail remained at their posts. The Greek camp settled into another night routine. A man arrived at the Persian camp after dusk, walking with cautious pace. Guards challenged him and brought him forward. His name was Ephialtes, a man from the region around Trachis, close enough to Thermopylae that he knew the slopes and side paths. He spoke to Persian officers and made his offer. A path ran over the mountains and came down behind the Greek position. A force could use it to reach the rear. Xerxes had spent 2 days watching waves fail. This offer gave him a way around that wall of shields. Ephialtes wanted payment and favor. Officers tested his knowledge by making him describe turns, landmarks, and distances. He answered with details that matched what scouts suspected. The trail existed. The Greeks had placed guards there. The guards were Phocians, not Spartans. Xerxes accepted the deal and ordered preparations. The selected force assembled in darkness with minimal noise. Men carried light gear for movement on steep terrain. Ephialtes took his place at the front. The group left the main camp and moved into the shadowed slopes. The route climbed through uneven ground with loose stones. Trees stood close in some places, forcing single file. The Persians moved with steady discipline, using quiet commands. They carried water skins and kept weapons ready. Near the top, the Phocian guards held their position. They watched the trail and kept a small camp. Some dozed. Others stood and listened. They heard the first signs, faint sounds of feet on rock, the soft clink of gear. The Phocians raised an alarm and gathered in formation. Persian troops advanced through the trees and met them. Arrows flew first, then spears. The Phocians fought long enough to make a decision. Their position sat near higher ground, and they pulled back to a more defensible point. The Persians had a different goal. They wanted the route behind Thermopylae. They left men to keep the Phocians contained and continued along the trail. The Phocians watched them pass below and understood what the movement meant. A runner left at once, moving downhill as fast as the terrain allowed. Before dawn, the Persian detachment reached the descending side and began moving down toward the road behind the Greeks. The terrain shifted. The slope changed angle. The trees thinned. Moonlight showed the line of helmets. Down at Thermopylae, the Greek camp held its night routine. Some men slept with shields beside them. Leonidas remained close to the front, awake, listening to reports. At some point, a message reached him. The report spoke in direct terms. Persian troops moved along the mountain path. The enemy aimed to reach the rear. As the sky began to lighten, Leonidas called allied leaders together. Officers arrived with faces drawn from lack of sleep. They listened while the report was repeated. The information left little room for argument. A Persian force approached from behind. The Greek position would soon face pressure from both directions. Men began to adjust their gear. The mood stayed controlled, shaped by training. Leonidas gave orders before the sun cleared the ridge. Men were shaken awake. Armor was pulled on in the half-light. Shields were lifted. Spears were checked. Officers gathered near the wall. The report was repeated again, slower this time. A Persian detachment had crossed the heights. The pass would soon have enemy troops at both ends. Leonidas listened to each allied leader. He asked for numbers of men ready to move, for the condition of the wounded, for how fast each unit could march. The allied leaders argued about duty and risk. Some wanted to stay. Some wanted to leave at once. Some asked for a chance to fight another day. Leonidas made a clear choice. Most of the allied contingents would withdraw while there was still a route open. Runners were sent with instructions. Pack up, move fast, keep formation, do not stop. A rear guard would remain to hold the front long enough for the withdrawal. Men who were leaving began moving at once. Some rolled up blankets. Some strapped on helmets and carried shields on their backs. The sound in the camp changed to the scrape of gear on stone. The withdrawal did not look like panic. It looked like hard organized movement under time pressure. Units formed lines and filed out in sequence. Men carried wounded comrades. Officers walked alongside and kept the pace steady. Leonidas kept men at the wall to prevent a sudden Persian rush. Small groups of Spartans stepped into gaps while allied units passed behind them. Some allies chose to stay. The Thespians made that choice. Their leaders spoke with Leonidas and then with their own men, and the men did not leave. They tightened straps and took places in the line. The Thebans also remained. Leonidas kept them within the remaining force and placed them where they could be watched. As the light grew stronger, the Persians at the front began to form again. Xerxes had received word that his detachment was moving into position. He expected the trap to close. The Greek line at the wall stayed in place. Fewer men than the day before, yet still in tight formation. Leonidas shifted the defenders back to a position that gave them room to maneuver and let them avoid being pinned from both sides. Men stepped to new points as officers guided them. They formed a compact block with Spartans and Thespians mixed, keeping shields overlapping. The first Persian push of the morning hit the Greek line with new confidence. The attackers came in a dense mass. Greek spears met them. The first ranks fell as they had before. The Greeks fought with the same discipline. Yet the situation had changed. The defenders could hear noise from the rear now, distant at first, then clearer. A few Greeks turned their heads and caught glimpses of helmets behind them. Officers forced faces forward again with shouted commands. The Spartans kept their formation and used short coordinated pushes to drive attackers back, buying minutes. The Thespians held close. The line could not extend. The line could only stay tight and fight in place. As the rear threat grew closer, Leonidas moved along the inside of the formation. He ordered the wounded who could still hold a shield to take places where the press would be less intense. He ordered attendants to withdraw if they still had time. Some left at once. Others stayed close until an officer pushed them toward the exit. The Persian pressure at the front increased. The Greek bloc responded with the last of its organized rotations. Fresh arms stepped into the front. Men with broken spears drew swords. The Persian detachment from the mountain path reached the road behind the Greeks. Greek sentries engaged them first and then fell back into the main group. The trap had closed. The defenders now faced two directions. Leonidas kept the remaining men together. Men who had spent 2 days facing north turned their bodies and shields in short steps to meet strikes from the rear, then turned back when the pressure at the front surged. Officers shouted, "Hold the line, close the gaps, keep shields together." The defenders stayed packed close. Persian troops at the front pushed forward in fresh waves. The troops at the rear began closing in. The ground underfoot shifted. Broken spears snapped under sandals. The Greeks continued to work their spears in the few inches of space, thrusting toward faces and pulling back fast. Leonidas gave a clear order to advance. The remaining hoplites stepped forward together toward the wider ground in front of the wall. The move required discipline under contact. Men in the front row shoved forward while men behind pressed in. Spears rose and fell. Persian troops tried to hook shields. Greek swords came out when shafts broke. The defenders advanced a few paces at a time, cutting down the men in front and forcing the Persian front to give ground. The Persians recognized Leonidas by his position and the bodyguard around him. Their officers pushed men toward the center. Arrows flew into the Greek mass from the rear. Greek shields lifted higher, then dipped again for the shove. The press grew violent. Eventually a strike found Leonidas. Accounts differ on the exact moment. The result was clear. Leonidas fell among his men during the final fighting. The Spartans and Thespians surged toward the place where he went down and formed a protective ring. They fought with new urgency, trying to keep Persian hands away from the body. The struggle happened at close distance. Faces were inches apart. A Spartan lost his helmet and fought bareheaded until a blade struck him. A Thespian stepped into the space without hesitation. The Greek ring held long enough to pull Leonidas's body back. Then the defenders began moving again because the rear pressure continued. They withdrew in short steps toward a small rise behind the wall. The movement was heavy and uneven under constant attack. Men carried wounded comrades for a few steps, then had to let them down. Some wounded sat against rocks with shields in front, waiting for the next rush. The Thebans reached a point where their officers made their own choice. Some began to move away with hands raised, trying to surrender. The Persians took them out of the crush. The Spartans and Thespians stayed together and kept moving toward the rise. Once there, they formed a rough circle, shields overlapping. The circle held for a short time. Persian infantry pressed in from all sides. The Greeks answered with stabbing spears and sword work. As more Greek spears broke and more men fell, the Persians changed tactics. Archers stepped closer and shot into the circle at high frequency. Arrows struck shoulders, thighs, faces. Some men fell backward and created gaps. Others stayed on their feet longer, swaying with shields raised, then collapsed. Persian infantry rushed in when they saw openings. The Greeks fought until their arms failed. The perimeter shrank as bodies piled. The last defenders stood on the rise with broken shafts or swords, pushing back attackers until they were struck down. The road, the pass, and the wall were finally in Persian hands. The dead lay where they had fallen. The Persians moved into the pass in full control. Infantry spread out, stepping over broken weapons. Officers followed with guards. Some men carried spades. The ground near the wall held the densest pile, dead Greeks and Persians mixed together. Persian soldiers searched among the bodies for living men. They found a few wounded and took them away. Xerxes came forward to see the place that had held him for days. He saw the narrow road, the wall, the ground littered with his own troops, and the bodies of the defenders who had stayed. His officers pointed out the positions where the line had held, where the final perimeter had formed. The king had achieved what he needed. The road south was open. The main army could march again. Yet the cost had been visible and the delay had been real. It had happened against a small force compared to his army. He responded the way an imperial commander often responded when resistance embarrassed him. He made an example. Orders went out regarding Leonidas. Persian troops located the body and brought it out. Some accounts say the head was taken. The body was displayed to warn other Greeks. The Persian army also had to deal with its own losses. Men gathered the dead and wounded. Wounded Persians were carried back. Surgeons cleaned cuts and pulled arrowheads. The clearing work continued. Spears and shields that could be reused were collected. By evening, the worst of the debris had been moved aside, and the Persian forces began to flow south. South of the pass, the Greek withdrawal continued under hard pressure. Men marched fast, keeping formation where the road allowed. Officers kept the pace with shouted commands. The wounded who could not keep up were carried. Some were left with water and a weapon. News traveled through the marching ranks. Leonidas had fallen. The pass had been taken. The last defenders had fought to the end. Men repeated these lines while they walked. The Persians were coming south. Runners went ahead to carry the news to allied leaders. The report forced decisions. Units shifted routes toward new muster points. Some leaders ordered men to fall back toward the Isthmus of Corinth. Others focused on protecting their own cities. Messages reached Athens with grim clarity. The land route into central Greece lay open. Athens faced the Persian army without the shield of a northern pass. The city's leaders turned debate into action. Officials prepared to move non-combatants toward safer places. Families packed what they could carry. In the harbor at Piraeus, ships loaded passengers. Civilian transport ships took many evacuees. Island communities received them with hurried preparations. Some Athenians went to Salamis, others to Aegina, many to Treason. At sea, the Greek fleet near Artemisium faced its own turning point. The naval commanders had fought difficult engagements with storms complicating movement. The Greek ships had taken damage and the Persian fleet had also lost ships. The key fact remained: Thermopylae was gone. Without a Greek army holding the pass, the fleet risked being trapped. Signals brought the news north. The commanders called their captains together. The decision followed quickly. The fleet would withdraw south to a position where it could continue to block Persian movement. Xerxes pressed his advantage as his army advanced into central Greece. The road ran through towns that had emptied or submitted. Persian scouts took control of key points. The main army followed, steady and heavy. Every day gained increased the chance of catching Greek defenders before they could finish building works. Greek leaders watched the movement and made hard choices. Athens moved on the order to leave while there was still time. Word spread street by street. Women packed clay jars. Men lifted children onto shoulders. In the agora, people gathered around public notices. Some argued. Others moved without speaking. In the harbor, crews pulled boats close to the piers. People stepped down carefully, trying to find space along the decks. The Greek leadership argued again, this time with less room for delay. Many Peloponnesians wanted a firm land defense at the Isthmus of Corinth. Workers were sent to dig and build fortifications. Spartan and allied commanders inspected the line. The plan protected the Peloponnese. It also left Attica and Athens exposed. Themistocles pushed the fleet as the main tool. He pressed for a naval fight in waters that would limit Persian numbers. The same logic that had made Thermopylae useful on land. Some leaders wanted to pull the fleet south. Themistocles insisted on fighting near Salamis, where the straits could limit maneuvering and protect evacuation routes. The debate grew sharp because each leader carried responsibility for his own city. While the Greeks argued, Xerxes advanced into Attica with the full weight of his campaign. Persian scouts marked routes. Infantry followed in organized segments. The Persians entered Athens and found a city that had sent most of its people away. They moved through streets that held more abandoned belongings than living voices. Some Athenians remained on the Acropolis, refusing to leave the sacred hill. Persian troops surrounded the height, brought forward archers and siege methods. The defenders threw stones and shot arrows. Persians used fire and forced entry. The last defenders were killed or captured. Xerxes ordered punishment. Buildings burned, temples damaged. Smoke rose above the city and could be seen from ships and from Salamis. Greek sailors and refugees watched from the water, gripping railings, recognizing familiar roof lines through the haze. The destruction did not end the war. It pushed the Greek fleet into a position where its next action would decide whether the Persian army could be supplied. The Greek fleet gathered near Salamis in crowded waters. Triremes anchored close together. Crews slept on decks or shore. The men ate small rations, cleaned hulls, repaired damage. Captains walked the line of ships and inspected oars. Hoplites assigned to fight aboard checked their helmets and shields. The atmosphere carried fatigue and fear. It also carried discipline. Themistocles moved between leaders and spoke about position, timing, and the need to hold steady. He also worked the political problem. Several commanders still wanted to move south. Some feared being trapped. Meetings ran late into the night. Themistocles used every tool he had, including deception, to force a fight in the waters he believed favored the Greeks. He sent a trusted messenger to Xerxes with a message claiming division among the Greeks, suggesting the fleet might slip away. Persian commanders already wanted a decisive naval battle. Xerxes also wanted a visible victory after the delay at Thermopylae. Persian ships moved to block exits and pressure the Greek fleet. Through the night, Persian squadrons took positions at the mouths of the straits. Greek lookouts saw the movement and reported it. The Greek commanders faced a situation where retreat became harder. Some leaders who had argued for withdrawal now had to accept the position. Orders went out along the Greek ships. Crews were woken. Oarsmen took their benches. Marines took their places on deck. The water filled with sounds of wood against wood, the splash of oars, the low calls of officers. The first light of morning showed the line of Greek ships in the straits, bows pointed toward open water. Rowers sat packed in 3 levels, hands on grips, waiting. Marines stood with helmets on, shields close, holding spears. Officers walked the narrow spaces and spoke in low voices. Themistocles stood where he could be seen. He knew the channels. He knew the wind patterns. He also knew that many Persian ships had entered the straits during the night, committing themselves to confined water. Across the mouth of the straits, the Persian fleet began to move. Persian commanders expected to use numbers to surround and crush the Greek line. The ships came forward in multiple squadrons. Some vessels carried extra troops on deck, men meant to board. The Persian ships also had rams and crews who knew trireme combat. The difference came from space. A trireme needed room to gain speed, to turn, to strike. A crowded channel reduced those options. When the Persian front ranks pushed inward, ships behind pressed forward and tightened the space. Oars bumped and tangled. Captains shouted and tried to keep alignment. The Persian fleet still had strength. Yet the conditions began to work against its size. The Greeks began with a controlled advance. The front line rode forward in short bursts, then held position, rams aligned toward the enemy. A Greek captain watched the distance and waited for a clear target. The goal was a clean ram to the side where wood would split. When the moment came, the oarsmen pulled hard and drove the ship forward. The bronze ram struck with a crack. The enemy ship lurched. As the Greek ship backed water, hulls scraped free. A second Greek ship moved in to finish the damaged vessel. This pattern repeated across the narrow water. Each captain made decisions based on angle, speed, and nearby ships. The Persian plan depended on keeping formations and using numbers. The straits forced the front into a tight knot. Ships collided with friendly ships. Some turned too sharply and exposed their sides. Greek captains watched for those mistakes and drove forward. A ship that lost its oars became hard to control. A ship that stalled became a barrier. In several places, Persian vessels packed together so tightly they could not build speed. Greek ships had the same risk, yet their captains had chosen this water because they expected the crowding to harm the larger fleet more. The rowers felt the rhythm change as captains called for sudden bursts, sudden stops, reverse strokes. Arms burned, shoulders cramped. Men kept pulling because the ship's survival depended on seconds. Xerxes watched from the shore. He had chosen a position that allowed him to observe. He expected a clear victory. He expected the Greek line to collapse. Instead, he saw his front squadrons jammed and struck. He saw ships splinter and sink. He saw men in the water clinging to wreckage. Persian crews fought back. Some managed successful rams. Some boarded Greek triremes and turned the fight into brutal struggle on decks. Yet the overall movement began to favor the Greeks as Persian coordination frayed. Individual actions stood out. Aeginetan ships worked the edges. Corinthian captains maneuvered to draw opponents into collisions. Athenian crews pushed hard at the center. Persian commanders tried to restore order, signaling with flags. Yet the noise swallowed many commands. As the battle wore on, the Persian fleet began to break into retreat in sections. Some ships turned toward open water. Greek ships pursued and struck. Others tried to beach to save crews. Many drowned because heavy clothing and exhaustion made swimming difficult. Greek sailors also died, especially those thrown into the water without support. Yet the balance of losses favored the Greeks. The straits became a place where Persian numbers turned into congestion and congestion turned into targets. By late in the day, Persian commanders accepted that the battle could not be recovered. They pulled remaining ships back towards safer anchorages. The Greek fleet held the straits and watched with caution. Crews bailed water, replaced broken oars, tied splints around cracked timber. On Salamis and nearby coasts, refugees watched the end and saw Persian ships pulling away. Some cried. Some simply sat down and stared at the horizon. Greek commanders gathered and took stock. Themistocles listened to reports and watched the sea lanes, thinking about what Xerxes would do next. Xerxes faced a practical problem. His army relied on supply routes that ran through the sea. His bridge over the Hellespont also mattered as the main route back to Asia. A defeat at sea did not destroy his land army, yet it changed the risk calculation. He could keep marching and lose control of sea movement. He chose to leave Greece with a large portion of his forces and return toward Asia, leaving a strong army behind under Mardonius to continue on land. The decision carried imperial logic. Xerxes preserved the core of his power and left a commander to attempt a finishing blow later. The war continued. Greek leaders prepared for another season with the memory of Thermopylae still sharp and with Salamis giving them reason to keep cities in the alliance. Winter came with practical problems. Mardonius kept the Persian army in Greece with camps placed where food and shelter could be found. He used envoys to probe Greek alliances. Some cities had already submitted. Some leaders weighed offers. Athens faced a second evacuation when Persian forces moved again into Attica. People who had only recently returned gathered bundles again and boarded boats. Greek commanders argued over where to meet the Persian army on land. A naval victory did not remove the need to stop the remaining invasion force. Spartan leaders arrived in force once religious limits passed. Units gathered from across Greece with hoplites in bronze and linen armor. The armies met in Boeotia near Plataea, a place chosen because it offered room for hoplite formations. The Greeks set up camp with defensive posture, keeping water sources in mind. Persian troops formed across from them with infantry, cavalry and allied contingents. Mardonius relied heavily on cavalry to harass the Greeks and disrupt water access. Skirmishing happened for days. Greek commanders adjusted positions, shifting camps to protect springs. The fighting turned sudden at moments with arrows reaching into Greek lines and hoplites stepping forward to push cavalry back. Both sides waited for a mistake. A turning point came when movement and confusion pulled parts of the Greek army from chosen ground. Orders traveled unevenly. Darkness made coordination harder. Units moved at different times. Some ended up separated. Mardonius saw the shift and committed to full attack. Persian troops pressed forward with speed, aiming to break cohesion. The Greeks responded by forming blocks wherever they could. Spartans took a central role. The clash became hard close fight as hoplites met Persian infantry at spear length. Greek shields absorbed arrows. Then the spear work began, steady and repetitive. Men pushed forward in compact lines. Mardonius entered the fighting with his guard, trying to drive men forward. He was killed in the crush. When the Persian commander fell, the effect spread. Some units continued fighting. Others began to pull back. Greek forces pressed them, maintaining formation and pushing into the retreating mass. The Persian camp became final resistance. Defenders tried to hold behind barriers while Greek troops broke in. By the end of the day, Persian resistance collapsed. The Persian army that had remained in Greece suffered decisive defeat. Survivors scattered or withdrew. News of the land victory moved quickly. It met other news from the Aegean. Greek ships and troops struck Persian forces at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The combined effect changed the direction of the war. Persian forces withdrew from many positions. The immediate threat of full conquest receded. Greek cities faced the work of returning home, rebuilding, and deciding what alliance would exist. Athens began rebuilding walls and restoring public spaces, using its fleet as leverage. Sparta returned to its own priorities. Rivalries that had been paused returned with time. Thermopylae remained a fixed point in memory. A narrow pass. A small defending force. A king who stayed. The fact that defenders included many Greeks beyond the Spartans mattered to those who knew the roster. The Thespians carried particular weight because they stayed with Leonidas to the end. The 300 Spartans became the most famous number because it was compact and fit Spartan reputation. Yet the defense began with thousands, and Helot attendants stood close behind the line through much of the fighting. The Persian victory at the pass also did not end the war. Greek leaders used the delay and the example to keep cities committed long enough for the fleet and larger land army to do their work later. The story kept its human details. Aristodemus left the pass with an eye infection and orders to recover. He returned to Sparta alive while his companions were dead. He faced harsh treatment and later fought at Plataea with intense aggression. Another Spartan, Pantites, had been sent on a message and returned after the battle to find the outcome decided. These details stayed in the background, yet they mattered in Sparta because they showed how the city enforced standards. The betrayal by Ephialtes became part of the record. Greek writers preserved his name and attached it to the mountain path. His act became a warning. Later reports describe his death at the hands of a local man, treated as justice. The landscape itself held the memory. The pass remained a traveled route. People could point to the hot springs and constricted ground. Memorials were raised, including a stone inscription associated with the Spartans that gave simple instruction to the traveler: report their obedience to Spartan law. The longer legacy grew from repetition and usefulness. Greek leaders cited Thermopylae when arguing for endurance. Later generations used it as model of disciplined defense. The facts that survived through writers like Herodotus provided the structure even when numbers carried exaggeration. The core sequence stayed consistent. Xerxes advanced with vast force. The Greeks chose a narrow choke point. The defense held for days. A mountain path was used to flank. Leonidas and allies stayed behind and died. The story lived because it could be told in a straight line from road to wall to final stand, and because it showed how a small group could slow a much larger army long enough for a wider coalition to organize and win later battles.